Well, welcome everybody this morning here and early evening in New Zealand. I feel from our sort of original chatting that I almost don't need to introduce Elizabeth Rankin. I think as some of the younger people here will have realized, Elizabeth Rankin is known to many of us. I've known her since 1978 when I began my Bachelor in Fine Art degree, my first degree. So that is 42 years, I think. Elizabeth's done amazing work in South African art history. In fact, played a huge role in establishing the discipline. A lot of her publications have been in the arena of sculpture and printmaking. And in fact, some of the ones on printmaking were done with Philippa Hobbs, who's with us and part of our group. So we feel like we sort of welcoming back an old friend, even though she's not officially part of our cohort. So great welcome to Elizabeth. Just another thing for those of you who don't know her to realize she's Professor Emeritus at Auckland University in History of Art. She was for a long time Head of History of Art at Wits University, and she also served 2 terms there as Dean. So welcome, Elizabeth. We're really looking forward to this new work you've been doing for the last few years on the Voortrekker Monument frieze. So we look forward. Thank you.
Okay, and here's where I try and bring up the PowerPoint for you to see. And to tell you right off that I've decided, because it's going to be so hard to control time, that I'm actually going to read this, which is not my usual style, but just so that I leave time at the end for us to chat, I hope. So Brenda has asked me to discuss the research behind the book From Memory to Marble. Not so much what my co-author Rolf Schneider and I discovered, but rather how we went about it. So the process, not the outcome. As it took over 10 years from inception to publication, doing so in about 45 minutes is quite a challenge, but I'll try to give you an idea of how it began, how we gathered material, how we wrote it collaboratively. If there's one key thing that's important for this kind of research, it's persistence. But on the other hand, research can be a strange beast, and discoveries came not only from good academic practice, but from surprising finds, unexpected encounters, and sometimes just pure luck. It's almost embarrassing to admit that the whole thing started by chance. Grant Parker, a South African teaching classics at Stanford University, had the idea to investigate classical influence in South Africa. And Cambridge University Press accepted his proposal for a book with specialists writing chapters from various angles. Now, with his own background in language and literature, he also wanted something visual, thought perhaps architecture or art. And so he invited me as his old dean from Wits, who was an art historian, and Rolf Schneider, a classical archaeologist that he'd got to know while he was on a Humboldt fellowship in Germany. In a remarkable coincidence, we both offered the same topic, the Voortrekker Monument. I'd thought it would be interesting to look at it as anti-classical, even though I deeply disliked the building as a symbol of apartheid. Rolf, in contrast, had been hugely impressed by it when he visited while giving a keynote at UNISA in post-apartheid South Africa. Anyway, I politely backed down to let Rolf do it, but he wouldn't hear of it and suggested that we write on different aspects. Next thing I knew, I received an invitation to give a paper at a colloquium in Munich in 2010. Absolutely no doubt that Rolf wanted to have a good look at me. Anyway, he confirmed that we should go ahead, each doing something different, but I bravely suggested collaborative writing because I always feel that I learned so much in the process, and said, let's rather tackle it together, and very nervously undertook to write the first draft. So the outcome was an essay on the Voortrekker Monument with the ironic title, Copy Nothing, which is the maxim of Gerard Moerdijk, the architect, to achieve a national South African style, which of course was contradicted by the many derivative aspects of the monument, not least its classicizing marble frieze. And we were both very surprised to find that although the architecture of the monument's been quite widely discussed, the only substantial literature about the extraordinary frieze, one of the largest in the world, was in the Voortrekker Monument's various guidebooks. It was said in passing by writers like Esme Berman that W.H. Coetzee had designed the frieze, but almost nothing was written about it, and even Coetzee himself hardly mentioned it in his autobiography. On a visit to South Africa, Rolf hunted down the Coetzee drawings prepared for the panels, which had been listed in the old Afrikaner Museum catalogue, now in Museum Africa. But then he came across another set in the Archive of Contemporary Affairs at the University of the Free State. And even more extraordinary was finding the 1/3 size maquettes for the frieze, not recorded anywhere. I'd been working at the Voortrekker Monument archives when one of the staff said, I might be interested to see something in a storeroom under the monument. And there they were, all in bubble wrap and deep dust. As a result of our interest, by the way, they're now displayed with pride in the monument. Now, it was fascinating that for some topics, there was more than one maquette, as was the case for Henny Potgieter's designs for the scene of Louis Trichardt at Delagoa Bay, and also further changes in the full-scale version, so that we could trace changes in the sculptor's thinking during the process. Now, the essay that we wrote for Grant's book was based chiefly on analysing the monument itself and these visual sources for the frieze, backed up with what was available in publications and a bit of archival research. But as we came to realise how little attention had been paid to the sketches and the maquettes, we felt that there was a major story waiting to be written. As an aside, I should say that we both had worked on friezes in ancient art, where you don't have any of this valuable information. I've always said it's a little bit like if I'd come across a notebook by Phidias, the records of the Athenian council on their finances, and Ictinus's model when I was working on the Parthenon. So we decided to investigate a bit further. To try to understand the bigger picture, we started searching unpublished sources more fully. We'd become aware of documentation in various institutions, like the National Archive in Pretoria, the Archive of Contemporary Affairs in Bloemfontein, the Heritage Foundation Archive at the Monument, and we began to go through them with a fine tooth comb, whenever one of us, or occasionally both of us, could manage a trip to South Africa. One of these joint trips was planned to work at the National Archives. Rolf wrote in punctilious German fashion in advance to inform them that we were wanting to see the minutes of the SVK. That's the Centrale Volksmonumenten Komitee, the committee that was set up to establish the monument. And we received a polite reply. But when we arrived, they had not been looked out for us. We spent a week in Pretoria waiting for them, to no avail. The heaps of material you can see in the photograph that hasn't been reshelved suggests part of the problem. Anyway, only after endless nagging email requests were they finally found, in the archive's vault, no less, and I was able to examine them a year later. Now, archives and minutes may seem dull, but in fact, they're a treasure trove of information. Just to give you a little context, the SVK had been formed after a meeting of the FRK, all these acronyms. That's the Federation of Afrikaans Cultural Associations in Bloemfontein in 1931, which was aiming to restore a sense of Afrikaner self-worth. The subcommittee, as it were, the SVK, was chaired by none other than Jansen, National Party Speaker of the House and later Governor-General of South Africa. The committee was tasked with building a monument to celebrate the centenary of the Battle of Blood River, where the Voortrekkers had defeated the Zulu on 16th December 1838. From the outset, they planned to tell the story of the Great Trek. Suggestions were called for, and there were long debates about what scene should be represented. This is the earliest set of possibilities we could find, compiled by Professor Fani Engelbrecht, Dr. Gustav Preller, and Mrs. Mabel Jansen. But while there were many suggestions of topics, at this stage there was no idea what form the monument would take. Only in 1936 they called for proposals, and some early ones were published in the newspapers, like these two in January 36. This huge Voortrekker by Coetzee, Steenberg, I beg your pardon, and the Egyptian-style temple by Anton van Vaux and Gerard Moerdijk. The designs that we are more familiar with first appeared in September 1936 by Gerard Moerdijk, and he was immediately appointed architect by the SVK. Now, although it was an architectural monument rather than a sculpture, Moerdijk had from the very outset conceived a grand frieze in the Hall of Heroes as the heart of his design, a monumental marble relief stretching for 92 meters. It is quite enormous. But how the various topics were going to be matched to the design was, of course, another issue. An important find amongst many documents in the Jansen files in Bloemfontein was a random sheet which we worked out was Moerdijk's diagram of how panels would be arranged in the interior of the monument. The real gem was the fact that it had different topics scrawled onto it, probably in Jansen's hand, to work out how the story should be fitted to the scheme. It's written in faint pencil and quite hard to read, but we could make out the different topics, some to extend across more than one panel, such as uittog, that's departure, from 1 to 4, and indications that they'd changed their minds and tried out different possibilities. It matches precisely the topics that Jansen took to the government as a definitive list in early 1937, after the government had agreed to assist with the funding so that the Voortrekker Monument could be a national monument, bigger and grander than originally conceived. So the first step that the SVK took, once all these things had been decided, was to commission Coetzee to make these sketches. Now, Coetzee was an enthusiastic, jumping the gun. He was an enthusiastic amateur historian who traveled around all the Voortrekker routes and was closely associated with the monument, producing the designs for fundraising stamps and souvenirs, about which he wrote very proudly in his autobiography, although he didn't write about the designs for the frieze. He made 22 sketches that matched Jansen's list and had the same dimensions as the panels in Moerdijk's diagram. So the two sets that we found, original drawings in the Museum Africa collection and Gestetner copies in the Jansen archive, were close, but they weren't identical. So what was their relationship to each other? The SVK minutes helped us to solve this because they recorded changes that the committee wanted in its obsession with historical accuracy. So let's take the descent of the Drakensberg as an example. Coetzee had shown the wagon with the back wheels removed and tree branches tied to the wagon to slow it down. Among other things, the minutes told us that The committee wanted him to show chains and brakes on the wagon instead. All in Afrikaans, of course. You've no idea how I had to revive my schoolgirl Afrikaans to translate these and the many other documents and books we consulted. And sure enough, the pencil drawing in Museum Africa included the brakes and chains on the wagon that you can see in the detail. We deduced then that the Gestetner copies in the Janssen file were made to show Koetz's earliest drawings to the committee, and the pencil sketches were the revisions that he made afterwards. But there was a further twist. When we examined the reliefs made by the sculptors in relation to the sketches, we found they followed the first set more closely than the revised second set. Here, the relief panel shows a wheel removed from the wagon and branches tied to the back axle, just like the first drawing. So initially, we had wondered whether the pencil drawings preceded the Gestetner copies, but the changes made for the committee were decisive evidence that the drawings were the later revised version. So we had to conclude that the sculptors were somehow given the first sketches to work from, which seemed extraordinary after all the discussion about the topics and the correctness of their portrayal. How on earth had this happened? Drawing up a timeline, we concluded that the main reason was that the sculptures were not begun straight away, but only about 5 years later. By then, they'd probably forgotten the debates, and whoever gave the sculptors the drawings to work from provided a set of the first copies. So why such a delay? Moerdijk had been very efficient in developing his designs once he was appointed in 1936. A full model of the monument was already on show at the Empire Exhibition in Johannesburg later that year, and his drawings were also rapidly produced. For example, this detailed design for the floor of the Hall of Heroes was already finished in 1937. But the building was a huge undertaking, and even when an architect was appointed, no site had been chosen for the monument. So for that, they had another subcommittee, which visited 12 places that had put themselves forward for the monument in 1936, explaining their relevance to the trek, whatever happened there that was important, and offering all sorts of free enticements, land to build on, free electricity and water, etc. Why Pretoria was chosen when it post-dated the treks smacks of a political decision. Fanny Engelbrecht had the habit of doodling during committee meetings, and a page of scribbles I found in the files at the Dutch Reformed Church archives made the thinking clear. Natal was too English for the Afrikaners, even though all these important things had happened there, including the Battle of Blood River. And the Transvaal embodied their nation-building aspirations. So Pretoria it was. But when it became clear that the monument would still not be completed in time for the 1938 centenary, the SVK found other ways to mark the occasion. A reenactment of the Osava trek traversed the country, visiting numerous small towns and building up interest in Voortrekker history, with men growing beards and women making Voortrekker dresses and kappies. Many historians consider this a significant event in the rise of Afrikaner nationalism. For the key day of 16th December 1938, a huge commemorative event was organised at the monument for the laying of the foundation stone. It was all very time-consuming, especially as it raised political issues about who should undertake this, which could be the subject of a book in itself. It was finally resolved by appointing women descendants of 3 prominent trek leaders to lay the stone. The outbreak of World War II further delayed things, so it was only in 1942 that 4 sculptors were appointed to work under the supervision of architect Moerdijk and the SVK. Sculptors with an English background were avoided in favour of relatively inexperienced Afrikaner artists who worked under the guidance of the more experienced German immigrant sculptor, Peter Kirchhoff. They worked at Harmony Saal in Pretoria, owned by Moerdijk, who rented it to the SVK to be used as a spacious studio. Peter Kirchhoff was in fact able to live there with his family, something that turned out to be of critical importance to our research. Let's take the panel they're working on, the departure of the Voortrekkers from the Cape, to see how we reconstructed the process. In 1937, Coetzee made a long drawing to fit the 4 panels set aside for the departure scene, Uittocht. There was a lot of discussion about this drawing and many changes proposed. I'll take just a few. They asked for a homestead in the background to show what the trekkers were leaving behind, the use of coins in place of paper money, the right kind of flintlock gun, and the all-important inclusion of a Bible to show what devout folk the trekkers were. And in the revised drawing, we see these items added or corrected. But as I've already pointed out, it seems that the sculptors were given the first sketch to work from. So 5 years later, the sculptor, in this case Peter Kirchhoff, made his 1/3 size maquette from the earlier sketch, simplifying the composition to make it more appropriate for a sculptured relief, but using many of the same motifs. However, the key changes that the committee required from Coetzee had not been followed. There's no homestead, for example, and no Bible. It's easier to see the design in the full-scale marble, and I've added some details to show that still life objects were included in the foreground, but as you can see, there's still no Bible. More puzzling was the complete omission of the scene on the left of the Coetzee drawing of the Voortrekkers selling up their farms, as it was an important part of the Afrikaner story, showing how much they were prepared to give up in order to seek freedom from British rule. In a eureka moment, we realized that an unidentified maquette that didn't have an equivalent in the final frieze matched this part of Coetzee's drawing. And when I was using a magnifying glass to examine the photograph of the sculptors at work, I spotted that this maquette had been set up in the corner position next to the departure panel. This would have extended the scene of departure across 4 panels, as had been proposed in the initial layout diagram. So it gave us insight into the sculptors having some freedom despite stringent overall control. In this case, they must have decided that it simply didn't work to have a scene turning a corner, and this one was omitted in favor of some topics that hadn't been part of Coetzee's sketches at all. For example, they added the Battle of Kapine, for which there's no sketch, nor indeed any mention in the lists of topics that had been discussed. We came to realize that there were 6 additional panels that hadn't been drawn by Coetzee, and these, together with the changes in composition of his drawings, underlined the contention that he was not really the designer of the frieze as had been claimed, something that I remembered sculptor Henny Potgieter complaining about when I interviewed him at the end of the 1980s while I was working on a big sculpture show. To promote the work of the sculptors, whom he felt had been overlooked, Potgieter finally got permission to add signatures to the panels and self-published an account of the frieze, which was very helpful to us in providing more details. For example, he described how the sculptors visited museums to study Voortrekker objects and particularly clothing. He also mentioned the use of animal models. Can you believe it? They borrowed oxen, sheep, and goats from the Agricultural College in Pretoria and temporarily housed them in the grounds of the studio. So we were gradually beginning to build up a fuller picture of life in the sculptor's studio. Unfortunately, Potgieter wasn't still alive to be interviewed about the frieze, which hadn't been my focus when I talked to him 30 years ago. But he had made useful little diagrams to identify the models that had been used to give the reliefs a lifelike quality, and we thought we might be able to track some of them down. For departure, Kirchhoff had included himself and his wife on the left-hand side, but like Potgieter, they were no longer alive. But we tracked down Mrs. Matzo Stradum, who'd been a model for the young woman in the presentation of the Bible when she was 19 years old. I visited her in a retirement village in Centurion Park. She was very willing to share her memories, as well as regaling Peter and myself with tea and cake. For example, she described the coldness of the wet clay on the calipers that Potgieter used to transfer the proportions of her face to the relief, giving us again some insight into the working method and reminding us that those figures are life-size. In fact, Martha Stradum had posed for 4 figures altogether, although only the first one was a portrait. And she described how the sculptors found some of their models at the nearby teachers' training college where she was studying, and how saving up the 2 and 6pence that she was paid for each session enabled her to buy Sondagskoene in a warm jas, Sunday shoes, and a warm coat. Another find was Daniel de Jager, a 92-year-old who lived in a rest home in Meyerton. As a youngster, he'd been apprenticed to his stepfather, who was the leading stonemason at the monument, and involved in the installation of the marble panels when they arrived back from Italy, where they'd been carved. So we had some understanding about how the full-scale panels were made in clay and how the marble panels were installed. But we didn't know how the panels were processed for their transport to Italy in plaster. I wondered whether Lupini Brothers, the Italian company in Johannesburg who cast the wagons that surround the monument, designed by Fricke Kruger in clay, whether they might have been the ones who cast the frieze. And it was then that I struck gold, pure chance. The person that I spoke to at the company couldn't answer my query, but he suggested that I speak to an old school friend of his because he remembered that his father had had something to do with the monument. And this was Werner Kirchhoff, son of the sculptor Peter Kirchhoff, still had many of his father's works in plaster casts, as well as many invaluable photographs and documents. Most significant of all, he had lived with his family at Harmony Hall in Pretoria. One of the windows on the front was his bedroom window. So he was on site while the sculptures were being made, and he actually helped during his school holidays. Werner had also been the model for 3 of the figures, which show him growing older across the time they were made. When he was 12, he posed for the boy Kruger, who was present at the Battle of Vechkop, for Dirkie Ace when he was 13, and for the young surveyor in the Church of the Vow when he was 14. It helped us to date the different parts of the frieze. Werner also confirmed that the portraits could be different from the body model, and Henny Potgieter identified always the portrait. In their search for the greatest fidelity they could muster, wherever possible, the sculptors used models related to the specific historical figure in frieze, sometimes old photographs or drawings, sometimes family members. And in this case, the portrait on Werner Kirchhoff's body was modeled on Paul Kruger's great-grandson, Louis Jacobs, who happened to be a school friend of Werner. Werner Kirchhoff's close involvement and excellent memory helped us to reconstruct the process of the making of the panels much more fully. He remembered how most of the first year, that was 1942, was spent making the 1/3 size maquettes, with each sculptor tackling a set. They worked on the veranda, while the main room was being set up for the full-scale models. The maquettes were cast in plaster to make them more permanent and set up as a mini frieze around the hall for the sculptors to consult as they worked. The next step was to transfer the measurements, 3 times that size, onto the backboard, where a carpenter built an armature of wood for the basic structure of the panels, which we could see in some old photographs that Werner had. Clay was then applied to the surface, the thicker areas supported by the armature. The sculptors were instructed to work together to prevent any individual style dominating, so that it was a genuine Volkswerk. On this large scale, that was a slow process. and we estimate that it would have taken from 3 to 6 months for each section to be completed. Werner was able to tell us that it was the sculptors themselves who made the molds from the clay reliefs in sections, guided by Peter Kirchhoff. We also learned that they destroyed the clay as it was washed out of the plaster casts and then reused for modeling the next panel. Luckily, the clay panels were photographed before they were destroyed, but there were no images of the plasters apart from a few grainy newspaper photographs. They showed that once the roof was on the Voortrekker Monument, the plasters were transferred there and put in place, so that the SVK and the sculptors could see whether the compositions were working and undertake some small modifications. The display of the plasters also caused one of the biggest scandals about the frieze. A reporter from the Rand Daily Mail sneaked in and photographed the Blaukrans massacre and wrote an article condemning the violence of the representation and suggesting that it could incite racial tension. He considered the motif of a baby being smashed to death against a wagon wheel particularly gruesome. It had been approved by the SVK in Kutzer's drawing and in the maquette and in the full-scale relief, because, as we found in reading the accounts recorded by Gustav Preller in Voortrekker Monument, there are eyewitness accounts of such occurrences. But there was widespread outrage. Letters to the government, letters in the paper, finally a visit by Prime Minister Jan Smuts, who decreed that it needed to be changed. So the offensive motif was expunged, and tucked away in the back of the monument's art store, we discovered a plaster fragment with the baby, the only bit of the plaster relief that has survived, quite ironically. Two of the sculptors were recalled to develop a new section for the relief, the rather improbable leaping figure setting fire to a wagon. The reliefs were modelled in large sections corresponding to the backboards in the studio, as we've seen in the photograph of the sculptors working on departure for the North Frieze. Now, it was relatively straightforward as it had been developed as a single maquette, and the scene was neatly divided from the other side by the door. But what we began to question was what happened with the longer friezes, like the south side, for example, where the maquettes of individual scenes had to be merged into a single frieze to make a continuous narrative. So it was our hypothesis that it would have been divided in half, bang in the middle of the murder of Retief. But Werner Kirchhoff remembered a single panel for the scene. Photographs taken at the time were divided the way we thought. But of course, as Werner suggested, the photographer might have done that since it would be difficult to print a very long photograph of the entire South Frieze. Then we had a serendipitous find. It was the result of long hours spent going through a newspaper archive in Cape Town's National Library, a frustratingly slow process with no specific goal in mind, but on the hunt for references to the monument, helped by my ever-supportive husband, who made photographs as I spotted things that might be useful. And it was, in fact, Peter, paging through a 1945 copy of the Volksden, who discovered a photo of the entire plaster frieze. And there we could clearly see the break between the two halves. Perhaps Werner had been remembering the maquette, which was a single piece, but the split in the making of the South Frieze meant that the full-scale murder of Retief had to be made in two sections, a difficult thing to achieve, which possibly explains the curious gap in the center of the composition, with only one body crossing the divide, the foreground figure decapitated by the split. But they'd have seen the problem when they installed it at the monument as a plaster, and we actually found a critique in the Larica Postma papers of this very point. So the sculptors seem to have learnt by their mistakes, as Blood River, made later, the central panel on the west wall, was apparently modelled as a unit by Peter Kirchhoff alone. although that was possibly also the result of some friction amongst the sculptors, which nearly ended up in a court case. There were all sorts of dramas. The photograph I showed of the South Frieze came from a set that were taken as the clay reliefs were completed, a necessary record because they were destroyed in the process of making the plaster casts. The photographs were later marked up with the different smaller sections cast in plaster and sent to Italy to show how they should be reassembled. Moerdijk had arranged for the Romanelli studio in Florence to undertake the task, and South African sculptors Larica Postma and Henny Potgieter were sent to oversee the job. It may seem extraordinary that the frieze was carved in Italy. It certainly added extra expense, but there weren't enough sculptors with the skill to carry it out in South Africa, nor the appropriate marble. So it made the long journey by sea all the way to Florence. And Rolf and I visited the studio in 2013, meeting young Raffaello Romanelli and his sister. He's a fifth-generation Romanelli sculptor and still runs the studio there. Sadly, there was no trace of the plaster, but it was well remembered. Although many studio documents had been lost in the Florence floods of 1966, we did find a letter describing the importance of the South African Commission in the 1940s, as it gave employment to up to 50 skilled Italian carvers who were out of work after the war. Traveling to different places like Florence in search of links and ideas became part of our research. After Italy, we journeyed to Leipzig to see the monument often considered prototype for Moerdijk. And there are many similarities, which I haven't got time to discuss here. But the scale of the Volkerslag Denkmal makes the Voortrekker Monument seem quite small and elegant. It's the only time I've ever seen someone needing to wear mountaineering gear to clean a figure sculpture. I was also able to visit other possible influences. 2 World War monuments completed in the 1930s in Australia, around the time Moerdijk was designing the Voortrekker Monument. The Anzac Memorial in Sydney shares a very similar profile and its Art Deco detailing. The Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne doesn't look much like it, but it shares 2 key features. It has an internal classical style frieze, and it was designed so that a ray of light would fall on an inscription, in this case, "Greater love hath no man," on Armistice Day. Now, you may be feeling these comparisons are a little far-fetched, since Moerdijk never visited Australia. But we had read that in the mid-1930s, the SVR card asked the government to approach foreign embassies for information about monuments to help them in their task. And in the Janssen files, we found an article on the Melbourne Memorial, specifically describing the effect of the sun's ray. And after much persistent hunting in the archives at the Voortrekker Monument, I found a cache of postcards and photographs sent from all over the world, like these of friezes from Edinburgh in Scotland, and a 3-volume set of designs by Schmitz, the architect of the Leipzig Monument, sent from Germany. Moerdijk also had knowledge of ancient monuments, as he did particularly well in his studies at architectural history when he qualified in London. There he would have known narrative friezes from the replica of Trajan's column in the V&A and the Parthenon frieze in the British Museum. We're convinced that its display at eye level probably gave him the unusual idea of making his frieze at that level the Voortrekker Monument. It was certainly very different from the monuments designed for Blood River itself, which my husband and I drove Rolf to see. It whetted his appetite for visiting more South African sites. He made a road trip to KwaZulu-Natal with his wife, traveling to memorial sites there, and we both visited the Vroue Monument in Bloemfontein on different occasions, all of these giving us insights into what you might call the memorial landscape against which the Voortrekker Monument was developed. And Peter and I went to the sadly derelict Voortrekker Monument at Winburg, the second site chosen by the SVK, and even got up at an ungodly hour on one Pretoria visit to witness the ceremonies at the Voortrekker Monument on 16th December, which continue to this day. Even at 6 in the morning, there was a huge crowd waiting to get in at the gates to attend a service, and the high point of the day, the rays of the sun falling on the cenotaph in the lower hall. I've subjected you to a whirlwind tour of some of the sources that we explored in our research, but equally important were sessions of organizing and analyzing the material that we gathered and beginning to write. A lot was done by email, with one writing a first draft, the other adding or modifying, back and forwards endless times. Rolf, who hadn't done this before, called it playing ping pong by email. But it was also important to have face-to-face sessions when we often made leaps in our thinking as we battered ideas back and forward. Our first session was in 2012 when the Centre of Advanced Research in Munich awarded me a 3-week fellowship to work there with Rolf. I had to present a seminar at the end, singing for my supper, as it were, and this was my first slide, for which I coined the term from memory to marble that has somehow stuck. Such seminars were very useful in getting feedback, and Rolf in particular did many presentations when he travelled around Europe and also in the US. When he was a visiting professor at Berkeley in California, 2014, he discovered many valuable South African texts in their library, far, far better than we had at home, and in some ways even better than South Africa. I was able to join him for a few weeks there, for once only needing one flight to get me to meet him. In 2017, we were granted Getty summer scholarships for a month in Los Angeles, working at the Getty Villa. This may look idyllic, but it was very hard work. The Getty Library assembled books from across the USA for us so that we could cross-check, fill gaps, reconsider ideas, and make further progress with our writing. We both firmly believe that it's important to start writing in order to know what you have still to research, but it's a big leap from gathering material to turning it into a coherent narrative. So where to begin? Quite early on, I came up with the rather crude idea of 5 topics: context, concept, process, image, heritage. We'd always intended to change them as we went along, but at the end of the day, they provided a helpful framework and we stuck with them. We decided to start writing in the middle, where we felt we had the most material. I would write the first draft of process, about the making of the frieze, and Rolf the first draft of image, analysing its form and content. I got on with process and read long sessions of passing it back and forward, often having to pursue more research to confirm or extend ideas. Rolf was still busy with image, so I tackled concept, how the form of the monument was developed. And again, we battered it back and forward at length. Rolf was still busy with image, so I drafted concept, the historical background. And as he was still busy with image, I then took a flyer at heritage. That chapter was perhaps the most vaguely defined, but turned out to be great fun to write, not only looking at the more somber aspects of heritage at the monument, but also responses it had evoked from other artists, ranging as widely as Minette Vari's haunting installation Chimera, Conrad Boerter's satirical back page about the monument in Bitter Comics, and the irreverent front cover of Losleaf, featuring Dina Blom van die Maand in front of the monument. The one-time editor just happened to be a good friend of mine who had also settled in Auckland. But back to the development of the book. If I've given the impression that Rolf was slacking and I was doing all the work, that is quite wrong. For not only was he actively working with me on the drafts that I initiated, but his chapter on images was growing exponentially. We'd always been aware that the frieze, like any artwork of this kind, was a construct, but we hadn't realized just how many questions it would raise. Here are just 3 to wrap up. The famous vow made on the eve of the Battle of Blood River, promising to hold the day sacred if the trekkers were victorious over the Zulu, doesn't exist in an official text. We'd already have realized this if we just compared the vow in the English and Afrikaans versions of the Monument's Guide. The translation in the English version meticulously follows the vow recorded by the person who gave the oath, Sarel Sillier, who dictated it on his deathbed many decades later. Sillier recounted the promise to honour the Victory Day but said nothing about a promise to build a church, which others claimed was part of the vow, and which was cunningly added to the Afrikaans version. Naturally, this made us a bit suspicious about the representation of the Church of the Vow in the frieze. The gabled building represented there was based on the Voortrekker Monument Museum in Pietermaritzburg, believed to have been the Church of the Vow and restored in the early 20th century. 19th century drawings show a much more modest building. The elaborate Cape Dutch gables were probably a later addition. And to compound this error, investigation of town plans and documents from the 19th century revealed that this building was erected as a parsonage for the town's minister and only used as a temporary church until one could be built. And nowhere is there mention that it was built to fulfill the promise of the vow. One last example. We're told that the Voortrekker occupation of Natal was based on a land treaty that Retief signed with Zulu King Dingane in early 1838. But as the king had Retief and his men put to death on their visit, no treaty ever reached the trekkers. Moreover, Francis Owen, the English missionary living at Dingane's homestead, wrote in his diary that the treaty was still to be signed on the day the trekkers were killed. Some 10 months later, after the Battle of Blood River, Pretorius and his men found the remains of Retief and claimed that they'd discovered the treaty in his leather bag. But curiously, Pretorius never mentioned this to anyone for 3 weeks, when he belatedly sent a copy to the English officer at Port Natal and another to a Cape Town newspaper. What became of the original treaty is murky. Afrikaans records say it was lost at the time of the South African War. We couldn't help wondering if there ever was a signed treaty. After all, how do you tell the difference between a copy and an original when they're all handwritten? At best, it seems likely that Retief took a draft treaty with him and that Pretorius garnered the signatures after he had found it. Rolf checked out the official records of the British copy in the National Archives at Kew, and after much nagging, I persuaded the National Archives in Pretoria to let me see a copy they held, which was locked in a safe inside the secure vault. With its old ink and stained and fragmentary state, it looks like an original, even though the records tell us that the document was lost. So was this a fake? These 3 examples that I've referred to so very briefly will explain why we came to realize that although we would still have a chapter called Images, giving an overview of the frieze in our book, we needed another whole volume to explore each of the scenes in detail. Only in that way could we demonstrate how the frieze gave permanent form to an interpretation of the Great Trek that reflected the ideology of the time as much as the history of the past. And it's an indication of how much research can develop and change over time that we now have part 1 and part 2 of From Memory to Marble. Thank you.